So, happy Women's History Month. Let's talk feminism, what that really means, why we have feminism in the first place, and how feminism affects masculinity. So, what is feminism? By definition, feminism is the advocacy of women's rights on the basis of the equality of the sexes. So basically, feminism is the same concept of the civil rights movement with respect to black equality, and it's just this movement of actions, advocacy, awareness that's brought to a community that doesn't feel like it has equal footing in society based on institutionalizations and systems that are put in place by the same government that's giving other rights to other communities. And so we've seen this time and time again, obviously analogizing to black equality is, I feel like, the most comprehensible way to understand female inequality. So the point in analogizing to the black community is to build this foundation and this concept that the same way we have seen black oppression historically still affect black equality, black opportunity, black success today is the same concept that has fueled this feminist movement. And it's a misconception to think that feminism is some new modern, Gen Z misconception of reality. Like, feminism is not new. Feminism has been documented. Feminism has been documented literally since 1776 when we were forming the Declaration of Independence. John Adams' wife, so future First Lady, wrote a letter to John Adams specifically and for him to read at the convention that was all about pleading for the advocacy of women's rights and for them to consider women when they were forming the foundation of the country, because already at that time, historically, they had felt like women weren't getting equal treatment. They were second-class citizens. And obviously, this is just taking into consideration feminism in America. We're a very recent new country, and we're already seeing these issues. However, feminism is a global movement. Female oppression is a global issue. We're seeing statistics where it's literally 1 in 3 women globally are either sexually or physically assaulted by men that they know, or strangers. Anyways, so back to the documented feminism in America. So we saw the first female rights convention in 1848. And so just to put in perspective, because I think that there's also this huge misconception that white women in America don't face oppression, So just want to put in perspective that we're talking about 1848. So majority of the women that were attending this convention were clearly white women. This was prior to 1865, so prior to Emancipation Proclamation. So black women simply just weren't free and they couldn't attend this convention. So we're talking about an outcry even during slavery where, yes, black women were enslaved, but white women themselves still were challenging their rights because they didn't feel equal. And that's just a small point that I wanted to address, because especially with it being Women's History Month, I do think that it's important as women that we stop going against each other in this feminist movement with saying, oh, you're oppressed more than me, blah, blah, blah. Like, we need to come together to dismantle the patriarchy as a whole. And yes, intersectionality is very much so real, and we do need to recognize that white privilege, although is more experienced by men, is absolutely still experienced by white women. However, white women absolutely are a part of female oppression. To me, the significance in making that point is because I often see when I'm having these types of debates or arguments online, especially with men, they love to constantly bring up the fact that as women in America, we should feel grateful for the rights that we have in comparison to women in other countries that we can clearly acknowledge have even less rights than us. I mean, India didn't even have a rape law until 2014. So with being able to recognize that even as American women, we may have some privileges that other women globally don't, I think that it's counterproductive to the feminist movement for people to try to use that type of analogy to criticize feminism. So the pressing question: how are women still oppressed? Even if they were oppressed in the past, because, the right to vote as a woman is only really nationally about 100 years old. The first states to give women the right to vote was Wyoming, and I believe that was in 1868. So the big question, yes, even if women were oppressed historically, women are equal today. So there's honestly copious amounts of statistics and examples to give as to reflecting why women still face oppression and why they're still unequal in society. From sexual abuse to gender pay gaps to gender hiring discrepancies to pink tax to the fact that women are still the primary caregivers despite entering the workforce, which not only affects their pay, which does contribute to the pay gap, but it also affects their overall opportunities and hiring probabilities. So basically, not only are women less likely to get the job during the hiring process, but even if they get said job, they're guaranteed to get paid up to only 82% of their male counterparts, despite having equal experience or education requirements. So they're getting paid less, they're getting hired less, they have more responsibility at home when it comes to raising children and taking care of household duties. Then you also have the fact that the pink tax is the fact that it's not just tampons. We obviously have to pay for tampons, which is ridiculous, especially when you walk into public restrooms and toilet paper is free, but tampons are not. And we can't control that. You're welcome that I bleed, because here you are. The pink tax is also the fact that women are paying more for most products that are geared towards them as far as like necessities and toiletries. Women are paying more for razors, deodorant, shampoo, anything that the average human would need. Women are paying more for it. And I think the most obvious way to put into light the fact that women are still very much so victims of oppression in America is simply just by looking at the statistics on human trafficking and domestic violence and sexual abuse. Human trafficking is modern day slavery, and we see that when it comes to human trafficking statistics, not only are the victims in the 90th percentile women, but 92% of human traffickers are men. So the most common victims of human trafficking in America are young girls between the ages of 14 to 17 years old. We often see statistics upwards of 42% of these girls being immigrants. And then other heavy statistics of the victims appear to be young girls that are homeless or in foster care, juvenile detention, in the system at young ages. And we know documented alone, there's 15 to 50,000 additional cases of human trafficking every single year. However, we know that this is just a fraction of the actual human trafficking that's going on, and research estimates that it's between 100,000 to 300,000 new victims of human trafficking. We know that the most common reasons for human trafficking are forced labor and sexual exploitation. And we know that 74% of human trafficking victims that are women experience both. So they experience sexual human trafficking as well as forced labor. I get some people are going to be like, well, like human trafficking is the most extreme example of something that's happening to women, but that's irrelevant. The point is that it's happening to women. And just to analogize again back to Black equality, if we still saw, we have 50 states. If we still had one or two states that hadn't abolished slavery, we would be like, yeah, Black people are still oppressed in America. So the fact that human trafficking is modern day slavery and it's happening to a single woman in America means that slavery and trafficking towards women is happening in America, and that's oppression. And I already know that the next argument is going to be, well, you're talking about government sanctioned actions and criminal activity, because obviously human trafficking isn't legal. However, if you really think about it, polygamy is legal in practice. So no, legally we're not allowing people to have multiple wives. However, we don't criminalize polygamist behavior. And we know that right now in Utah, there's an epidemic going on when it comes to birth abnormalities, because the rate of incest that's happening in these polygamous communities is astronomical. And polygamy is very much so a modern form of female oppression, in the sense that when you look at these demographics of the people in the household of polygamous families, we're seeing 12, 13, 14, 15-year-old girls getting married at young ages to 30, 40-year-old men. Oftentimes they're in some way related to these men: uncles, cousins, brothers, stepfathers. I mean, even in the worst scenarios, we're talking like full-blooded parents are marrying their own children in these communities. And this is happening right here in America, and no one's doing anything about it. The show Escaping Polygamy and the show Sister Wives really shed light onto these issues. And I know that there was some type of controversy that occurred where the show was banned because it was bringing too much light to the reality of polygamy in Utah and these other communities where very immoral things are occurring, and the people that are bearing the burden of polygamy are the women in these relationships. And the unfortunate reality with these sexual assault statistics is the same reality that we are very much so aware of when it comes to human trafficking, that this is just the statistics of what is reported. There's so much more going on that we never know about or we never hear about. We know alone that 92% of college rape victims don't even report. So that's taking into consideration that majority of sexual assaults aren't even being reported, and there's a lot more sexual assault going on by domestic or intimate partners, which is also what discourages the reporting. The statistics say that it's 1 in 10 women that have been raped by an intimate partner, which again, that's of the women that have probably reported. There's a lot of really toxic and unhealthy expectations and normalities that surround what sex is appropriate in an intimate relationship. And you have people like Donald Trump as the president saying things like, you can't rape your wife. So it's extremely alarming to really consider the abuse that women are facing behind closed doors that they don't even realize are abuse. Domestic violence statistics against women in America are also extremely alarming. 1 in 3 women are the victims of physical abuse. 1 in 4 women are the victims of severe physical abuse. There's upwards of 20 victims of domestic violence every single minute in the United States. We do know majority of victims of domestic violence are women. Also, an alarming statistic that I didn't know was that 72% of all murder-suicides involve an intimate partner relationship, and 94% of victims in those incidences are females. Then, on top of it, 19% of all domestic violence disputes involve a weapon. Victims of domestic violence suffer economical impacts that I don't think are acknowledged or made aware, but it's estimated that 8 billion days of work is lost due to domestic violence by a partner, which equates to about $8.3 billion a year that these victims lose out on. 21 to 60% of them actually lose their job due to domestic violence in some way. And then it also says that victims of domestic violence are more vulnerable to HIV and other STDs because of the likelihood of forced intercourse. The overall point is that feminism doesn't exist for no reason. It's the embodiment of the known and recognized and acknowledged and resourced and accredited and researched and globally understood fact and reality that women have suffered historically and still do presently globally. Yes, the burden of oppression is graver in different countries, different areas of the world, but that doesn't diminish the fact that American women absolutely are still suffering from societal and legal discrepancies that affect our overall quality of life and opportunities. I also think a key point to make before concluding this is that feminism is not this ideology that men don't suffer, that men haven't experienced depression, that men have it easy, not this ideology that's anti-men. It's pro-women. It's about acknowledging the fact that as humans, we all suffer on the daily basis. We're all victims to capitalism. However, different communities are facing disproportionate realities, and that's where intersectionality and understanding it comes in is extremely important, because intersectionality is this concept that a person suffers from more than one categorization. So you have, women in general suffering, then you have Black women who suffer because they are experiencing racial oppression as well as gender oppression. And so understanding that humans as a whole suffer, women as a whole suffer, and then amongst these communities are other reasons why women in those communities are suffering as well. The emphasis that I'm trying to put on intersectionality is to get men to understand that they can very much so experience struggle, hardship, oppression. Like I said, we're all victims of capitalism. Thus, we're all oppressed based on our economic status in society. Obviously, you have the elite who wake up and breathe money, but for the majority of us, daily life can be a struggle to survive sometimes, especially with inflation and all the crazy things that are happening in the world right now. So understanding intersectionality is understanding that there is levels to oppression. Like, it's not okay to just say, oh, we were all oppressed, or everyone was oppressed at some point. Like, yes, at some point historically, you're going to find some sort of crucifixion, persecution, oppression, slavery, all the crazy things in majority of civilizations that have existed in time, but it's not an excuse. We can't just continue to accept the fact that things aren't equal, things aren't right. We can't weaponize the fact that everyone has experienced some form of oppression to trivialize the group that might be experiencing it the most at the time. Evidence of progression doesn't justify current inequality. We have to stop telling people to be grateful for the rights that they do have and the fact that they may have more freedoms and opportunities now than people historically did in their similar positions, because all it's doing is leaving room for plateauing on rights and potentially retrogression. That's the same ideologies that were trying to be pushed on African Americans in the 1800s after 1865 when they were freed. But no, they kept fighting through the Black Codes and through the Jim Crow era and, achieved civil rights. And still to this day, we see the Black Lives Matter movement, because progression doesn't happen overnight. And we have to stop trivializing and silencing people's voices when they're expressing why they're still not equal today. I didn't address some of the most obvious things as far as like abortion rights, gender roles, and women, staying home and cooking and cleaning and all that stuff, because I think that those are extremely subjective examples. They're extremely subjective examples, and those open doors to other debates, because if you yourself don't agree with abortion, then you obviously don't think any woman should have that right. You don't think humans in general should have the right to it. So that just opens doors to different conversations. However, if you feel as though there's nothing wrong with human trafficking and sexual assault and domestic violence and the alarming realities that I shared to you that American women are facing on the daily, there's just no words. I didn't touch on some of the most obvious hot topics of feminism and female rights, especially obviously things like abortion. That could be an entire video in itself. I obviously completely support pro-choice. I think having control over your own body is just a fundamental human right. You will never see the day where we force men to take birth control or get vasectomies. If men could carry children, I promise you, getting an abortion would probably be free, let alone legal. So that's a whole whirlwind of discussion. So what I've noticed is that feminism appears to be this threat to masculinity. At least it's perceived that way, because feminism is absolutely about dismantling the patriarchy and dismantling toxic masculinity and societal implementation of those characterizations and those traits, which, because majority of men themselves are victims of the patriarchy and their roles in society being decided for them by historical men in the past, it feels like an entire threat to their identities, because they think that these traits, these toxic masculine traits, are a part of being masculine. The ideologies that all men are put here to be protectors of women and the providers and the ones that must go to work. You guys have to consistently be brave and strong. You're supposed to have less fears than women. You're supposed to cry less than women. You're just supposed to rub some dirt in it and take it to the chin. And as a result of those toxic traits being perpetuated as masculine traits, you have all these men walking around projecting toxic masculinity and then feeling the urge to protect the very thing that is oppressing them themselves. Science and psychology and plenty of anthropological and sociological research studies have correlated a lot of this violence and aggression that we see being perpetuated by majority men in society has correlations to these toxic masculine traits that men have been being preached since the beginning of time. Like if a man is consistently told to not have these type of emotions and to bottle them up and to not cry and basically just suppressing their emotions, it's going to create this unhealthy reaction to them. So the same way that we've seen the patriarchy instill toxic traits and expectations amongst men, we see the same instillment of toxic expectations amongst women in society. And so now we have this nation that is perceived on paper to have equal opportunities and rights and freedoms. However, just because a law is passed doesn't mean that it changes the reality of society and the way that people interact and treat one another. And so we still live very much so in a patriarchal society in which individual men aren't perceiving women equally, even though a law or a piece of paper might tell them that they have to. You still very much so see the men that have the ideologies and the perspective that the woman's role is in the home. It's to cater to the family, cook, clean, raise children, even despite whether or not that woman is working and also financially contributing to the home. You also have this ideology that men are inherently more predisposed to need and desire sex. Thus, it's almost like there's this entitlement that women not only owe men sex, but that it's inherently moral or more moral for a man to step outside of a relationship or be promiscuous or, free in his sexuality, whereas women are consistently considered to be devalued if, they're not pure or virgins. It's absolutely way more frowned upon for women to be sexually promiscuous than men, even though you see the sexual exploitation of women so graphically in media and content. Majority sex in the sex industry and sex work, it is majority women. Women are dominating sex work industries and are compromising the majority of sex workers, but you have to look at it from the other perspective that the majority consumer of sex work, pornography, sexual content as a whole are men. So it's another reflection of the sexual exploitation of women and another reflection of this toxic and unhealthy natural perception that men are overly sexualized beings naturally, thus it's normal for them to over sexualize women. And you have to understand that the increase in the sex industry with things like OnlyFans and porn and all that is because so much of a woman's value is placed on her vagina. Women's value is placed on the ability to bear children and has been historically. And then now men seem to be fueled by sex. You see almost like escorting and prostitution becoming so commonly practiced because men are so willing to pay for vagina. We have a nation now where women weren't allowed to be educated, they weren't allowed to vote, they weren't allowed to participate in legislature, and now you have all these new opportunities and rights that women are able to participate in these things and essentially have the same opportunities as men in society, but it's still the average citizens and humans that are compromising majority of society and the ones that are expected to implement these new rights and these new freedoms. And unfortunately, on the individual level, there's not a consensus that women are equal. Thus, the societal effect of inequality is still very much so prevalent. Same way that the denial of white privilege by the white community perpetuates white supremacy, is the same way that the denial of female oppression and patriarchy by men still influence female oppression today. When majority of the people that have the power to make systematic change are people that are amongst those that are already privileged, and then they don't see the difference in their treatment to the group of people that are marginalized, why would they make a change? Why would they take a risk in trivializing their own opportunities that they're already privileged in and guaranteed to fight for something that they are not seeing themselves? Women comprise less than 30% of Congress or any official body of legislature with the ability to influence American laws and society. And thus, we need men to understand our reality because they have the ability to change our reality. And even individual men have the ability to affect individual women's lives. And we saw that a perfect example of that is with the fact that majority of voters of Donald Trump were men, statistically, by gender, and by race it was white men. And thus Donald Trump was extremely vocal in his campaigning prior to ever winning the election that one of his main agendas was to attack abortion rights. And so if men had been aware of the fundamental rights that women are entitled to control their own bodies, or were in agreement in support of that agenda, you probably wouldn't have seen as many men supporting Donald Trump, who was making it very well known that he was going to attack women's rights when he was in office, and did. At the end of the day, if you want your sisters and your daughters and your mothers and the women in your life that you care about to have the same quality and experiences in life that everyone should be able to have, understanding and comprehending the true impacts of things that are going on in society and how laws affect, the safety, the economics, the mentality of women, especially with these new abortion bans. It's extremely important to supporting those women in your lives. Stop watching Andrew Tate videos and other propaganda online that perpetuates this utopian fairy tale that America is doing everything right and everybody's equal and progression and start speaking to the women in your lives. Start actually asking real people about their real experiences and recognize that we know we've been taught so many falsehoods in education, in the media, and the news, and lots of things are sugar-coated and pretty pictures are painted and bows are put on the presents, and the reality is so much different than what we are perpetuated to believe. Boys can cry, girls can play in dirt, boys can wear pink, girls can wear basketball shorts, boys can cook and clean, and girls can go to work and go fishing. We need to stop labeling what a human being should like and what they should do and who they are, and we should just fucking allow people to live.